Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, visit our website at greenpilled.network, where you can download the GreenPilled Book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local GreenPilled.network chapter. My guest today is Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, and we talk on this episode about Vitalik's interest in public goods. Why does public goods matter to Vitalik Buterin? We talk about his vision for public goods funding within the Ethereum space, but also how Ethereum could export public goods funding to the world. We talk about what is exciting to Vitalik about the public goods funding space in Ethereum in 2023. We talk about the highest leverage points in the public goods funding Ethereum space. And we talk about Vitalik, basically what parts of the space he think are underfunded and where we need to make investments in order to build more momentum in public goods funding. So this is a special episode for me because Vitalik, in many ways, is the genesis creator of Ethereum, but he's also the creator of our value set around public goods in the space. Not only from a pragmatic point of view, ecosystems that fund their public goods are going to be the ones who are winning, but also for the goodness that comes out of public goods. And so, Vitalik's a hero of mine. I'm sure that for many of you, he's a hero of you as well. And so it's just a really fun opportunity to interview the inventor of Ethereum and the inventor of quadratic funding about some of the public goods in the space that he's building. So I think that this is a good snapshot in time for where public goods funding in the Ethereum ecosystem lives in 2023. And I am very excited to present to you Vitalik Buterin. Enjoy.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hi, Vitalik. How are you?
Good, Kevin. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks. Thanks for agreeing to do this podcast with me. I wanted to dive in on public goods funding in the Ethereum space. Could you start teeing us off by talking about why public goods matters to you and why you've sort of imbued that as a value in your writing and in your work?
Sure. I mean, I think the fact that public goods are important to like both Ethereum and to just any crypto ecosystem, I think is just something that becomes super obvious once you spend enough time in it. Like, all of these ecosystems depend totally on open source software, on protocol research, on things that once they get created benefit everyone in the ecosystem, but that still needs to somehow get funding for them. And I think within this space, we also see lots of instances of situations where when a public good version of a thing does not get developed, often much more centralized versions of the thing that are much more limited and give much less power to users get developed instead. And there's just lots of examples of this, I feel, everywhere in like both in Ethereum and the crypto space, but then I think it's also a pattern that exists across the internet in general and, given just all the different parts of the offline world, right? Like scientific research is a thing that all of humanity really benefits from, right? And, if one guy figures out how to make a solar panel, then that's more efficient. Then everyone can go and start benefiting from that. Everyone gets better electricity, and then on top of that, everyone benefits again because polluting sources of energy decrease because there's more alternatives to them. So there's just like so many different instances where there just are these really important things where they need to be created, they are valuable, but they have this property that once they are created, like either they don't get created or released at all, or they do get created and they kind of benefit everyone without being able to discriminate between like people who paid and people who didn't pay. And being able to have good ways of funding these kinds of things is just a really important challenge.
So in hearing your answer there, I couldn't help but notice that it feels like funding public goods is a practical matter, just it's what's best for the Ethereum ecosystem, but it also feels like it's something that's good for society even outside of crypto ecosystem public goods. When you think about Ethereum and public goods funding, are you thinking more about tangible matters of public goods for the Ethereum ecosystem, or are you actually thinking this will be one of the biggest exports as Ethereum reaches scale, if it becomes a backbone of an internet financial system, that it'll actually export public goods funding sources and mechanisms to the world?
Some of both. I think one thing that's important to remember about public goods is like all kinds of public goods exist that have different scopes, right? And like almost any public good is scoped to some kind of community. I mean, I think things like like fighting against climate change, as I mentioned, might be like the closest thing we have to an exception, because basically, unless you're like Canada or Russia or Norway, the Earth's temperature going up is like very significantly bad for you. And so that covers like most of the planet. But if you think about things like, let's say, for example, creating translations of blog posts, let's say not even about crypto, let's say about like chemistry into Turkish, right? Like that benefits people in Turkey, that benefits Turkish-speaking communities in other countries, that particularly benefits people who care about chemistry, right? So like every public good, I think, is attached to some particular community, and like ultimately, there are some that have these extremely large scopes, and there's definitely some whose scope comes close to approaching basically all of humanity. But then there is also all of these public goods that have smaller scopes, and I think they're both important. The way that I see Ethereum playing into this is that I think, first of all, public goods are just obviously hugely important for Ethereum itself, and there's a lot of like very specific properties of the Ethereum ecosystem that make them even more important than usual, right? I think just the decentralized nature of the space makes it even more inadequate than usual to have a centralized version of a solution to any particular problem. And the challenge is that if you create a decentralized solution, then often enough it's not going to have a business model for the creator baked in, and so it does become a public good, right? Like if it's decentralized, you can't have some kind of gadget in there that discriminates and like only makes the thing available to people who contributed to paying for it. So within Ethereum itself, I think they're super valuable, and I definitely do have this hope that the Ethereum community can be a testing ground for these mechanisms. And once the mechanisms get developed and perfected here, they can be exported and applied to a whole bunch of other spaces as well, right? Because I think ultimately those spaces are facing like basically the same kinds of problems.
My sort of basic intuition is that the properties of blockchains that you get when you build a public goods funding mechanism on top of a blockchain, transparency, uncorruptibility, globalness, and programmable state machines would be a really big advantage for building public goods funding mechanisms that disrupt state-based funding mechanisms, which are not transparent, which are arguably less accountable to their constituents. And so it feels like blockchains give a lot of really fundamental advantages when it comes to designing a mechanism that's more democratic or accountable to a population of people. And I'm wondering if you think is that a competitive advantage that will help blockchain-based public goods funding mechanisms disrupt traditional ones in the future? Do you have any sort of vision around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think blockchains in general are very good substrates for implementing systems of rules, and basically implementing them in such a way that they're transparent, so like everyone can see what exactly the rules are. Everyone gets a guarantee that the rules are being followed. It's all being done in a way where it becomes much harder to cheat. And those things are definitely valuable, right? Like I think the closest analog to this is just like democratic voting systems, right? Where like people, not being able to cheat and the rules being open is something that's like incredibly crucially important. But I think public goods are just like so diverse and so dynamic and so rapidly changing that the whole kind of paper-based let's have an election once every 4 years thing is just totally not going to work for them, right? And so I think like blockchains are very well positioned to be the home of some of these economic mechanisms that try to do a better job of like identifying which public goods to fund and directing resources toward them.
Yeah, I kind of think of our work in blockchain-based public good systems as high-resolution democracy. Just look at the 300K data points we get per Gitcoin grants round and compare that to voting once every couple of years in a local election in analog democracy. And it makes me really excited about getting a high-resolution map of what constituents care about. You know, quadratic funding is not perfect, but it is a high-resolution sort of system that people will actually participate in. So high-resolution democracy is a meme that comes up in my mind. I'm not sure if you have anything to add on to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent frame. I think I might have even used it in something that sounds similar to it in one of my posts myself a couple of years ago. Like, okay. Even like social media as a currently somewhat dysfunctional but potentially really improvable version of high-resolution democracy is like another one of those kind of metaphors to think about.
Yeah. Speaking of social media and public goods, I don't know if you saw, but myself and Raid Guild launched a version of quadratic funding on Lens, where every Lens post is a grant and every tip is a quadratic funding contribution. And we're able to raise 20K for anyone who talked about EthCC in France this year. So my basic intuition there was that you spend 15 minutes per quarter funding your Gitcoin grants, but what if public goods funding was imbued into our social media atmosphere? And it was a way of upranking what was good for the public goods, not just what gives me a dopamine rush. So looking forward to experimenting more with Farcaster and Lens and Web3 Social and integrating public goods funding mechanisms into those.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
What are you most excited about in the public goods funding space? I guess maybe starting within the Ethereum public goods funding space.
So to me, the public goods funding space basically has two halves to it. One half is figuring out where the money comes from, and the second half is figuring out how to allocate the money. Okay. And both of those are hard problems, right? And they're hard problems in different ways. So as in terms of just ways of just collecting capital, I mean, I feel like this is a thing that's been just slowly, organically improving within the Ethereum ecosystem over time. Like, I remember even back in 2020, I think I remember there was one time where you were on Bankless, and the state of the Bankless nation is fun, ding, and the whole episode was like about how everyone was so excited that like finally other projects and like not just like what was it, like myself and the Ethereum Foundation, a couple other people are actually willing to contribute, and now we have not just Gitcoin contributors, we also have Optimism, which has basically made a long-term commitment to keep putting funds into RetroPGF pretty much forever. We got that announcement. Well, what was that? Was it like an Ether ETF or something that promised to like put 10% of its profits into Protocol Guild for 10 years or something like that?
Recording this on Sunday night, VanEck, the Ethereum ETF, announced on Saturday that they're going to give 10% to Protocol Guild, which is hugely legitimizing, I think, to them. Yeah. But a great source of funding for Protocol Guild. Yeah.
No, I think that's amazing, right? Like to me, I think the biggest thing has always been like trying to move from one-time grants to having steady sources. And I think, like Optimism positioning itself as a steady source and, the VanEck ETF positioning itself as a steady source, like that's amazing, right? So that, I think I'm happy that, we're moving toward more progress there. And then the second problem, I think, it might actually be the bigger and more important problem. And one of the reasons why is because the better that problem can be solved, the more I suspect people and organizations would be willing to donate to it. Like, how do we figure out actually which projects to fund, right? Like if there was a strong, effective, and credibly neutral pot where you just know that if you throw money into the pot, public goods projects and people behind them would actually be compensated, and it gets done in a way that's like reasonably fair, then that's something that lots of people would be willing to like potentially automatically airdrop to and so forth, right? So that is it's a big challenge, right? And I mean, obviously, quadratic funding and retro funding are two of the mechanisms that are really trying to go in there. I think probably the biggest challenge that I see is basically creating higher fidelity sources of information about like who contributed to what projects are upstream of what other projects, probably helping to better surface projects that are really important but that are less visible. Like basically trying to find and support things that are 2 or 3 steps behind things that are in the public eye, reduce people's feeling that they need to market themselves and talk about how cool they are in order to get more funding, and like basically really start solving some of all of those problems, right? And so I think in the case of Optimism RetroPGF, the one thing that's interesting is that they're starting to, like, I think, experiment with moving towards some kind of delegation and some kind of multi-layer structure. The thing that I find interesting about the work on hypercerts is that it just basically standardizes the whole model. Then, I mean, I saw that I think on your podcast, he talks to, I forget the name, the founder of T.xyz, right?
Max Howell.
Yeah. Right, Max Howell, yeah. My understanding of that project is like it obviously primarily is like just a package manager, which is important to the good by itself, but it's also trying to like actually figure out sort of what is the contribution graph and like what things are responsible for or dependencies are contributing to what other things, and like actually do a better job of kind of automatically collecting that information and making it easier for people to kind of fund entire ecosystems instead of just individual projects. So I think that's cool, right? I think it's good that there's all of these different pieces of the puzzle that are getting developed. And I think what I would hope to see is, standardization, obviously, it would be nice if we had an open standard for each piece of the puzzle. And then aside from collaboration between the different layers of the stack, obviously, right? It would be nice if some of these systems actually, used and built on top of the tools that got created for the other stack. And just basically, moving forward to having this ecosystem where it becomes more and more normalized for people's contributions to public projects to get recorded and recognized automatically.
So let me just play that back. I asked you what you're excited about in the public goods funding space, and then we talked about the difference between funding sources and mechanisms, and it seems like they kind of have to grow. There's like an impedance matching between funding sources and mechanisms. And so within funding sources, Optimism is doing great things on sustainable recurring funding, and then the Protocol Guild and just people contributing back to Ethereum protocol core development on VanEck. And then in mechanisms, we covered retroactive public goods funding, quadratic funding, Protocol Guild. I guess Trent calls it a self-curating registry, which are sort of interesting mechanisms. And then you sort of talked about the Keynesian beauty contest issue with mechanisms where the stuff that's the most visible gets funded. And so how do we solve that? And then I think you kind of drilled in a little bit on open source software funding and the opportunity with T.xyz to create a dependency graph of all the different open source packages, and that way you can track their impact and fund below the surface a little bit more. And then you said standardization, everyone working together and having it sort of normalized to fund public goods would be the sort of like, I'm really interested in figuring out what the highest leverage points are for builders inside of Ethereum spaces. So, what do you think the highest leverage points are for the average builder who has software skills or design skills or copywriting skills or memetic skills to contribute to building this movement of public goods funding in the Ethereum space?
One interesting place to start where I feel like there hasn't been much work on yet is like basically taking existing data sources on the internet about people's contributions, like even just things like GitHub commit records, and each research post and similar things. And I mean, first of all, just like standardizing those as data sets and trying to convert those into like in data in some format that's a kind of a better match to the actual problem, which is basically identifying like which project is a dependency of which other project, and like which person contributed how much to which project at a particular time. Like that feels like something that should be possible for anyone to just like go and do independently, right? And like you can probably hackathon out a proof of concept for like, hey, yeah, like here are the top contributors to this project based on GitHub data. I mean, obviously it's the sort of thing that it really, needs to be done carefully, just because like any way of measuring people as activities is going to inevitably overvalue some things and undervalue other things. And at some point, it's just once you like set the mechanism in stone, it's going to be gamed. But at the same time, the nice thing is that contributions made before this meme becomes a thing are probably not going to be gamed as much, and so you can start from those and you can reward those. I think it's probably this is the nice thing about Retro, right? Is that you can also kind of fine tune the details of the mechanism retrospectively after the fact. Yeah, I think that's one place to start, and then trying to integrate that into some of these existing systems. Like, does it make sense to have a thing that like auto prints hypercerts on some layer 2 based on records that have already existed?
So it feels like what we're trying to solve for here is better tracking impact as it happens, and then that makes it easier for builders to build mechanisms that reward that impact with profit.
Right, exactly. If we can like standardize data sets of the form, given project X, here are projects A, B, C, D, E, blah, 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 that are its dependencies, and here's the percentage share of contribution of each one of those to X. And then also given project like, like Y, who are the people that directly contributed to it during particular time periods, and what is their share? Like if you just have even open data sets of that form, right? Like then that becomes something that's quite easy for people to just go and use in retro funding mechanisms in the future.
Becomes quite an interesting onboarding experience where if we have all of Web 2 open source software developers getting onboarded into crypto by receiving money for the impact that they had instead of buying a bag, then that's a totally different go to market for crypto, or first experience with crypto for those people. And those are influential people for influencing the rest of the world to use crypto. I'm wondering what would be the incentive of a project to give back to their open source dependencies? Is that just good marketing? Like why not just free ride? I guess I always come back to how do we solve the free rider problem when it comes to people actually giving to these kinds of projects?
How do we solve the free rider problem? I mean, compensate the people who are not free riders, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Is there anything else within impact tracking and smarter mechanisms that you're excited about?
Yeah, actually one interesting particular thing is when we start thinking about rewarding people for impact with rewards other than money, right? So like to give one example, so Taiwan has this gold card program, right? Where it's basically a visa that allows you to live and work in Taiwan for 3 years, basically, kind of equivalent to a residence permit, though, definitely focused on digital nomads to some degree as well. And one of the interesting things about the Taiwan Gold Card is that it has a rule that one of the ways that you can be eligible for it is if you show that you've been actively contributing to open source for the last 8 years, right? And like that's new, right? Because normally, we think of governments like immigration authorities as being pretty stodgy people, and like they really care whether or not you have a degree of Harvard, and if you work for a company, like show me your salary and things like this. But like here we see Taiwan like actually being interested and innovative in that particular way, right? And what I think is interesting about that is that is a reward for people who contribute to open source, but at the same time, like it's not a cost to Taiwan, right? It's a benefit to Taiwan. And in fact, the better a job they do of identifying people who like actually deserve it, in the sense that like actually have made valuable contributions to open source, not only will that make it better for the contributors and for the world, but it'll also make it better for Taiwan as well, right? Because like if you find higher quality contributors, then like you're rewarding higher quality work, but at the same time, you're actually getting the higher quality people to come to you. So that's something that can be replicated within the Ethereum community to some extent, right? Like, I think the Protocol Guild, I believe, also has a rule that, like, if you're in the Protocol Guild, you get like free tickets to participating conferences or something like that, right? Which I think is again one of these very smart things, right? Because conferences are these very kind of network dependent goods, in that maybe the ticket costs $800, but if you give a ticket to the right person, you're not sacrificing $800, but you might actually be benefiting quite a bit, right? Like, there's the trope that, like, actually, 80% of the value of a conference has nothing to do with like what people are blabbing on stage. It's all about the networking and the people and the informal discussions. And so, like, if you bring the right kinds of people in, then, like, that's a huge, like, actually value add for the conference as well. And so basically, I view this as this kind of untapped arbitrage opportunity, in the sense that if you can, like, basically there's a high correlation between people that are good contributors to public goods and people that are just good to have around in a lot of contexts or, like, places or situations. And so if you have a good way of identifying those people, then, like, that could also be not just a way of determining who gets money, but also a way of determining, like, who gets the ability to participate at conferences, events, potentially, like immigration into countries, potentially, like virtual forums and all kinds of things. And that's a reward that is, like, therefore much cheaper to give, right? Because the better a job you do at identifying public goods contributors, the more you're actually identifying people who are bringing value to your network and increasing the value that you're giving to the rest of all of your paying participants. And, like, this seems like the sort of thing that is sort of done. I mean, it's been done informally since the dawn of human civilization, but, like, really creating larger scale formal mechanisms to do it seems like it could also unlock a huge number of opportunities as well. And, like, what's interesting there is that you can basically reuse a lot of the same rails, right? Like, you can reuse the same infrastructure for determining who contributed to what project, and you can use that both for funding and for giving these kinds of non-monetary rewards. And then the people who are giving the non-monetary rewards, like, they're actually benefiting from this, and so they actually have an interest in participating and contributing to this infrastructure and helping it to become higher quality, right? So I think that's something that's also interesting and probably could be done a lot more. Like, I think there's a really untapped opportunity for some kind of synergy there.
Yeah, and it feels like in a lot of ways that would be realizing the vision that y'all put forward in the Decentralized Society paper. But this is just a very public goods vector on it, is getting social capital out of your contributions to public goods. Speaking of network phenomenons, I was wondering if we could talk about retroactive public goods a little bit. I've just really been obsessed with this idea that if there is hundreds of millions of dollars of retroactive public goods funding in, I don't know, let's say 10 years from now, 2033, then it makes sense. It's rational for someone to start contributing to public goods today on the assumption that eventually they'll have an exit or a huge financial opportunity into the future. I know this is a vision that you've talked about in the past. How do you feel that that's going? In what ways can we support the creation of this sort of reflexive, network-based outcome for the world? It feels like a very high leverage point to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the big thing right now is that it just needs to be happening regularly enough and on a wide enough scale that people can start to expect that, if they do something that is valuable, then they're going to get a retro reward of some kind. We've seen quite a lot of projects get rewarded, but, like, it's still a relatively small number of, like, relatively big, kind of big and really kind of long time and established ones. And once that both scales up a little bit more, probably scales up in the diversity of things that it's funding, and it just has a longer established history, and so people become more confident that this is something that's here to stay, and this is something that's going to exist for me 3 or 4 years in the future. That's going to contribute to this ecosystem where it just becomes one of the things that actually motivates people to contribute. right? I feel like we've seen this happen with quadratic funding to some extent, right? But I think the more diverse sources of funding there are, the better it is actually for individuals, like even from a risk mitigation standpoint, right? Because like if people are getting funding from like multiple sources, then the risk is much lower than both of them are going to disappear on them at the same time.
There's this idea of anti-fragility coming from diversity. If you're a public goods funder, say you're Left Terrace from Rocky, and you're getting funding from Gitcoin grants and Clear Fund, and also retroactive public goods funding on Optimism. And there's also, I think, DAO Drops is doing retroactive public goods funding, and I'll just throw in Giveth because Griff and I are friends. Then the diversity of income sources kind of creates anti-fragility against any one mechanism or any one project.
Right, exactly. And I think this is also another one of the reasons why, thinking about like funding contribution graphs instead of just like looking at each project individually can be valuable, right? Because if you think about like even something further upstream than something like Rodkey, if you think of like even people who created the Ketchak hash function, for example, like I believe they got a bit of a reward from RPGF, but like basically the kinds of people that, the internet had that fatal bug 10 years ago because it turns out that the open SSL people were getting like $4,000 of donations or something. Like if you just create automatic mechanisms that detects that like, hey, actually like 500 things are downstream of you, and so you automatically get percentages of things that go to any of those 500 things, then like that's like 500 away redundancy for the funding to exactly those projects that are the most critical for the Ethereum space or for the net to stay standing.
This actually reminds me, Zach Cole and I have been working on an EIP 6968. We almost got 6969. But it's contract secured revenue, which is basically a mechanism that allows you to basically any L2 that integrates contract secured revenue, any smart contract that is called the gas from that smart contract that is not burned 1559 style will go back to the deployer of that smart contract. So you can kind of create a sort of rewards mechanism for smart contract developers.
It's interesting. Like I've thought about this. Like I've actually come up with I think a similar idea a few years ago. Let's I wonder if I can find it in real time. Okay, there we go. Developer incentivization in protocol contract author fee rebate 6179. Basically, the main criticism of stuff like this is that it's just a little bit too easy to get around, in the sense that like if I make a contract, then there's an in-protocol rule that says that like this, let's say there's a 25% rebate going to the contract developer, then someone else can just fork that contract, and if they fork that contract, then they can go and like put in a 24% rebate going to the user, and then it's going to be in the user's interest to just like use that version instead. And so kind of in the limit, it becomes not super different from essentially donating or tipping. So that's like the criticism that's usually given pause to these kinds of ideas. And like the thing that I came up with in 6179 actually does try to do a clever thing that basically tries to make it sort of a little bit more robust against people making forks, but it's still very far from perfect. But yeah, I think my view on this in general, I mean, you've read all my posts, right? Like anti-collusion is an incredibly hard problem. And if we don't have like a good sort of protocolizable solution to that, then the next best thing is to try to keep reward mechanisms sort of off-chain, or at least kind of one step removed from the protocol logic, so that if it's discovered that they're being taken advantage of, then like that reward can be patched in some way. Yeah, I mean, like I do really appreciate the kind of reasoning behind all of this stuff, right? Like it's a really valuable to just like have this very simple and direct mechanism that's like you get paid in proportion to how much people use your library. Like I think that stuff is super beautiful, but I think it's definitely worth thinking through like what exactly is the version of this that minimizes these kinds of issues.
Yeah, for sure. Well, contract secured revenue, we're going to take an L2 centric approach, and I want to get it deployed on the public goods network, which will hopefully attract more developers to the public goods network. My hope with the problem you described was that people won't use a copied contract for the same reason that you don't use the forked version of Zcash that doesn't have the founder's reward in it, because it's less legitimate. It doesn't have Zuko's name attached to it. It's not the one that's supporting all the privacy research. Like, there's going to be a legitimacy aspect to choosing the right contract would be my hope, but we'll see when it gets borne out.
Right. I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, the challenge is that I think these legitimacy things really depend on network effects, and like contracts don't really have network effects at all. Like, I think in this case, it's the more comparable situation is kind of like pirating versus not pirating, right? Where a lot of the time, like pirating is very possible, and whether or not people do it just has to do with their day-by-day feelings about the ethics of the situation, which often, like change drastically based on like how well the major media companies are behaving and whether or not they're doing stupid stuff like making content completely inaccessible in certain countries or whatever. I mean, I definitely support it as an experiment. Like, I think if you asked me to plug the hole in 10 seconds, I would say, you can delay the rewards by 30 days and then have a governance gadget that can potentially shut off revenue going to individual contracts that look like they're forks. But or you can just like try pushing it out without controls and just like see how it goes and respond to problems if they actually arise.
Yeah, for sure. The more like laissez-faire approach would just be to deploy it and then iterate towards. And that's not dissimilar to what we've done with Gitcoin grants, which has a huge collusion problem by virtue of it being quadratic funding. Just make the Sybil resistance a little bit better every single quarter.
Yep.
There's one quote that stood out in your most recent interview with David from Bankless. I think it was the permissionless interview. You said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, which was DAO governance and public goods funding are in many ways the same problem. And I think you were talking about within the context of DAO's public goods. I wonder if we could click and zoom on that. Do you remember saying that and exactly what you meant there?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think what I mean by that is basically that, like, ultimately both of those are subcases of the problem of just having a decentralized mechanism be able to make arbitrary decisions where the quality of those decisions is something that is just not like mathematically provable or verifiable by the protocol in any way. So in some ways, it's like the problem of making like mechanisms for groups of people to agree on stuff with like no simplifying considerations whatsoever. And like DAOs making decisions and choosing which projects to fund for public goods are kind of both just different aspects of that. Though I think I did later kind of also mention that like there are some practical differences between the two, which is basically that public goods funding is much more likely to be concave than DAOs making individual decisions, right? Because like DAO decisions could potentially be very big, right? Like if you think like one particular example is like, imagine you take something like RAI, right? Which is a stable coin that's tracking the US dollar. But then let's say 30 years from now, a crazy situation happens and the US dollar hyperinflates. But then RAI as a currency, like it has a community, it still needs to be useful. Its users still, like, even if they thought they wanted to track the dollar, they have a deeper underlying need, which is to be financially safe. And so maybe RAI just has to make a sudden decision of like, hey, we're going to depeg from the dollar, and from this point forward, we're going to follow like some particular version of the CPI or the euro or gold or something else, right? And like that's a very kind of binary flip sort of thing. And you don't really sometimes like in those kinds of situations, you don't really want compromise. What you probably want is like being able to choose a particular path, like stake it out and then be resolute and stick to it. But with public goods funding, like for the average situation, if you have two projects, then like flipping a coin for which one to give X is generally less good than giving both of them X over 2. There are exceptions, right? So like, for example, if we want to maximize the probability of us going to the moon, then I think giving $50 billion to one randomly selected person in the world is probably better than giving each person in the world like $7. But like most things that we do are not on that level of scale, right? And most things that we do, it's kind of much more marginal what the benefits are.
Oh, I think that's a good overview of concave versus convex decisions. If you search Vitalik.ca and you search for concave versus convex, you'll see a visual graph of that, and it really helped me grok the decision. Grok the concepts. Have you heard of Vitalik? There's some mechanisms that help turn democratic decision making into more binary decision making. I don't know if you've ever heard of assurance contracts.
I have, yeah. Those are great.
Yeah, assurance contracts are basically a mechanism where you can say, I'm going to run a fundraise, and if it gets up to X amount, then it'll be fully funded, aka we can go to the moon. But if it doesn't, then everyone gets their money back. And it's sort of a way of migrating between a concave and convex decision. So I'd be curious to see those kind of gadgets be used more in the public goods funding space.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember when Alex Tabarrok, who I think came up with dominant assurance contracts, which are a spin on assurance contracts where basically there's like some entrepreneur who agrees to give people even more than 100% of their money back if the project fails. He made a post on Marginal Revolution, I believe, responding to quadratic funding, basically saying like, hey, actually quadratic funding can be combined with assurance contracts or dominant assurance contracts, and that might be even better.
Yeah, one of the projects that's going on at Gitcoin right now is taking us beyond quadratic funding. The new protocol is called Allo Protocol, which is short for Capital Allocation Protocol. And the plan is to build in quadratic funding. Of course, we've already got, but quadratic voting, badge holder-based voting, conviction voting, dominance assurance contracts. And so I'm really excited about having a Swiss Army knife of all of the different capital allocation mechanisms out there and starting to A/B test them together. But it also gets really cool when you start to combine them with each other. I think you said that someone suggested we combine QF and assurance contracts. So maybe that'll be something that we run around with in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to, so going back to the question about DAO governance and public goods funding being the same problem, and, maybe they're sort of related problems, but not the same problem after what you said. And I'm wondering if we feel like Optimism retroactive public goods funding is actually, a really intelligent marketing campaign for Optimism, but also a way of organizing their ecosystem's public goods. Is retroactive public goods funding in Optimism a really smart way of funding Optimism's public goods? And therefore, have they invented a new widget for DAO governance in a way?
Interesting. I mean, in some ways, yes, right? Well, I think what's interesting about Optimism is that at least the way that I understand the vision, it's it starts off from Optimism, but then it ends up supporting a kind of Optimism and then Ethereum and then a kind of the internet and wider things.
All public goods, yeah.
As well as the scale increases, right? So, as I mentioned, like them, funding Ketchak was probably one good example of kind of something more broad, right? Because Ketchak is, the hash function that Ethereum is built on. But yeah, it absolutely is incredibly useful for Optimism itself, right? And so I think it's a model that could easily be copied by other layer 2s or DAOs or other kinds of projects.
Yeah, my hope had been that now we've got a bunch of layer 2s that have multi-billion-dollar treasuries. What if they were all in a competition to fund their ecosystem and the world's public goods against each other as a way of gaining market share with each other? It'd be a great way of sort of leveraging Moloch in order to solve a very Molochy problem.
Absolutely. That would be so amazing.
So we're getting towards the bottom half of the hour, and maybe I'll start asking a few open-ended questions to see if we can't go down any interesting rabbit holes. What do you think everyone is missing, and what is everyone getting right with respect to public goods funding in the Ethereum space? So what is everyone missing? What is everyone getting right?
I mean, one thing I think that the ecosystem is getting right is just the general drive toward moving into having this wide diversity of different funding mechanisms and just having them all run and kind of setting them up to be autonomous, for the long term and at the same time, right? So, that includes things like, like Gitcoin and RPGF. It also includes some of the Ethereum Foundation's moves to try to, avoid growing the foundation itself, but try to focus on fostering organizations that can grow into being independent things, almost kind of like mini foundations that are focused on somewhat more specific goals. Just people's ongoing willingness to keep putting money into the matching pools, I think is really valuable and really good. The work by, like Hypercerts and T and like really trying to systematize the problem more and really, kind of push it up so that it can scale more, I think is good. Though it's something that we definitely need a lot more of. I'm trying to think like what are things that we're seriously missing. I can't actually come up with any yet.
Well, that's a really positive answer to hear. It feels like maybe there's an opportunity, going back to your first answer to the question, in that like setting up these matching pools so that they auto run, and setting up the Ethereum Foundation for a subtraction mindset. It seems like we're sort of envisioning a public goods funding future as more of a hyperstructure, in that it can run trustlessly, it can run without human intervention, it can run without Kevin Owocki behind Gitcoin or any one central intermediary. Is that something that excites you, or were you taking that in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think human involvement is always going to be necessary, but having it be something that feels like almost as autonomous as possible, and like as something that people can just kind of rely on to exist, kind of like how like people in countries just rely on the legal system to exist and kind of keep functioning sanely, I think is something that's really valuable. Like, the legal system, I think, is an interesting kind of analogy, right? Because there's a huge number of things that it gets wrong, just like in terms of requiring people to like have expensive specialists just to do basic functions. But the thing that it does right is that it is remarkably decentralized compared to most other aspects of governments, right? And it is like remarkably close to it's closer to the ideal of a like self-support sustaining automaton that's like just like run by a bunch of people who are like off doing their own separate thing than any of the other branches of government. And in the it would be really cool if public goods funding got to at least that level, and potentially taking advantage of modern technologies that kind of got even further, right? Like, there definitely would be a dystopian aspect if everyone had to hire kind of funding optimization specialists so that would kind of help them. They pay them $300 an act, and then they figure out like, hey, here's what you do to get more money, right? But if you just like get to the point where it's a thing that just exists, that just keeps running, there's lots of different parts of it, and it just like feels like a well-oiled machine that keeps going and it isn't dependent on like the whims of like one or a small group of individuals, then like I think that would already be amazing.
Yeah, well, I know that the hope ever since you and I were geeking out on Gitcoin grants and quadratic funding together was to have a round every quarter, and that eventually people would get to a point where they can just expect that the rounds run like clockwork, and then people can do things like work on public goods instead of getting a job or doing an ICO. And of course, now it's more than just Gitcoin. There's Optimism and Giveth and Clearfund and all these other great projects, gadgets for rewarding public goods funding. And so it'll be interesting to see us cross this threshold where we can create serious behavior change, because the public goods funding is just so embedded in the bedrock of the culture and of the community. It'll be interesting to see if and how that evolves in the future.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, I got two final questions as we wrap, Vitalik. The first is, if we are maximally successful in funding public goods, what does the world look like in 10 years? So it's 2023 right now, 2033 in 10 years. How has the world changed because Ethereum has gotten so good at funding its public goods?
Hopefully we would see many more kinds of public goods out there, and there would be much more of an expectation that if there is some piece of infrastructure that's really valuable to either Ethereum or like to the wider internet, or even aspects of the world outside the internet, and you just go and start contributing and people start using it, then like some level of like reward starts kind of almost automatically trickling in. And that the consequence of this will be that we're going to see just like less proprietary solutions to problems and more open solutions to problems more generally, right? Also start seeing a world where more things, like both within crypto and outside of crypto can just be open source from day one, because opening things actually would be good for your revenue instead of being bad, because the earlier you open, the more you can be at the bottom of the close to the root of the contribution graph, instead of having to worry about like other people stealing your work. Hopefully we can actually see a crypto space that has less reliance on centralized actors and more reliance on just like very well constructed pieces of open software, whether it's like wallets or client service or people providing data or whatever else. I definitely hope to see even kind of potential companies and like maybe even governments to some extent experimenting with using systems that are similar to this, and like basically just creating an ecosystem where if someone identifies something that is valuable and just goes and does it, then they can just expect to get some at least enough level of a reward that they can keep doing the work and keep focusing on the work instead of having to kind of be a volunteer and have a sort of main job that pays for their bills. And obviously it would be good to Lofterus being able to keep working on Rodkey, and for that to just kind of really succeed, and for him to not have to worry about the amount each quarter would be amazing.
So the meme that's come out of, I think, Optimism is impact equals profit. So if I'm an agent in this system, AI, since we're talking about 2033, I'll just say AI or human, then if I have some sort of impact, some positive impact, then I can make profit off of that. And so I don't have to go out and get a job, or, I can create impactful projects instead of just profitable ones. Is that too reductionist, or is that directionally kind of?
I think it's directionally there, yes.
All right, final question, totally open-ended one. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
I mean, one thing that I think would be valuable for us as an ecosystem is to try to work toward over the next few years as kind of really pushing hard on making at least these funding sources kind of more automatic and actually long-term guarantees instead of just being one-time grants. Can we get to the point where, for example, every layer 2 and not just Optimism has some share of their funds going to a public goods funding gadget, and then that public goods funding gadget can just kind of automatically cover both things specific to their roll-up and things that are kind of broader to Ethereum as a whole, or potentially going even wider. Basically, as the sources of data become higher and higher fidelity, and we can get something that kind of approaches being incredibly neutral, can we get to the point of sources of funding being able to really make long-term commitments and try to actually put some portion of their profits or other parts of their capital to kind of reliably go into those streams every quarter. Basically, I think the big thing to think about is while these things are very experimental, it makes sense to do them in this kind of very abstracted way at the top of the stack. But then as they become more and more entrenched, we want to actually start creating these longer term expectations and guarantees, and kind of move toward more and more protocols giving out tokens in a regular way in this way. And I wonder what are some good intermediate steps that can help keep pushing us in that direction.
So moving towards more automatic and long-term guarantees, probably trustless guarantees that public goods will be funded, will just help make sure that the liquidity flows.
Exactly.
Do you have a good sense of how much of that funding should go to my own ecosystems, public goods, versus the dependencies or other parts of the world? Do you have a basic sense of what a good guideline is?
I think what would be interesting is to pre-commit for projects to pre-commit to a guideline that says, while the project is smaller, the focus would be more narrow, but as the project becomes bigger, the focus would widen automatically. The reason why that's valuable is first of all, when a project becomes bigger, it just makes sense for its focuses to start to become bigger. But also it's a kind of pre-built-in way of essentially ensuring alignment. Like even if a project actually starts to grow to become very large. And so, I think like actually coming up with like what that rule could be and kind of codifying and standardizing it, I think could be really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be a combination of technology and also social norms. So appreciate you imbuing your value for public good in the space and in your work. And I appreciate you making the time to have this conversation for me. I know that lots of people want your time. And, I appreciate you giving me an hour to talk about this stuff. So Vitalik, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you too.
All right. Peace and love. Thank you.
Yes, you too.
Alrighty, we just heard from Vitalik Buterin. I am very excited about this episode because I think Vitalik has a lot of good thoughts about the future and the present of public goods funding in the Ethereum space. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, we are featuring the people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems in the world. I think Vitalik, with the creation of the public good that is Ethereum, but also imbuing his value for public goods into the community, is a great example of this. If you value our work, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time. Peace and love.